Good evening.
Don't you think we just need to build more houses? That's the real problem with the system at the moment.
Absolutely, completely the crux of it. There's a lack of supply of property and too much demand, really, just to put it into one phrase. You've hit the nail on the head. Population growth, people want to be more mobile, smaller households. And there's just a shortage of property. What we've built in the last year is at least 100,000 less than a fairly modest target of 300,000. And so the problem is only going to get worse.
And the population figures that we've had have been higher than anticipated. So when the European issue arose, there were expected, I think, to be 2 million Europeans who would qualify for a certificate to allow them to remain, and it turned out to be 6 million. And that's part of the issue, that we haven't been counting the population correctly to provide the houses that they then need.
That could well be the case. Obviously, the more people, the more the demand. Of course, many of those people would have been coming over to build some of those houses, and so there would have been, certain great benefit there. But it is, in short, just too many people. It's almost a case of musical chairs, really.
And what would you do if you were able to reform the planning system? Is there a silver bullet, or is it incremental change just to make it a bit easier to get those permissions?
There are things that can be done. Of course, we are quite quick to criticise NIMBYs, but of course, not many of us would like a block of flats at the end of our garden. So, people often have good cause for it. But there are just millions of houses that could be built on brownfield sites, many of which are owned by councils in rather sort of rundown town centres. There's properties above offices and shops that could be developed. So not everything has to be built on our green and pleasant land. Some of it can go on our sort of brown and rather ugly land.
And that's one of the issues, isn't it? Because brownfield sites in the green belt are very difficult to develop, even though they're currently ugly.
Absolutely, yes. And, of course, any decision can take so long, so many years to get through, perhaps partly because of NIMBYs, but also just a lack of momentum. Could even be the working from home thing. Councils have slowed down since COVID, perhaps. And so it really is just a case of having to focus all efforts on getting as many properties built as possible, and that's only going to be done with planning reform.
And providing people with what they want. Surveys have consistently shown that people want, 70% of people or so want houses with gardens. Whereas planners keep on wanting to give them tower blocks. Now, I'm convinced that you should give people what they actually want, and you should allow developers to give more green space in development, so lower density, because a garden is just as much a green space as a field of oilseed rape.
Absolutely, and very important for society. Families must have somewhere to play, to dry washing even, and that's of course plays into the fact that many of these tower blocks have problems with condensation and mould because people don't have anywhere to dry or to air the place properly. So yes, there is a lot wrong. Many of the flats that were built by developers were almost entirely snapped up by buy-to-let landlords, both nationally and internationally, and some of them really just left empty as investment vehicles. Of course, any buy-to-let is an investment, but an empty flat is really just waiting for appreciation.
But if you look at our figures on empty properties, they're actually lower than comparable countries, and what you would expect from death and divorce and the other things that lead and redevelopment that you need. I often think the politicians go for the easy options. They say empty properties are the issue, second homes are the issue, Airbnb is the issue, but it's not, it's building. And if you build sufficiently, then people can do what they like with their property, but very few people are silly enough to leave a valuable property empty for very long because it's a source of income.
That is very true. I think that really it would be prime, particularly London property, Manchester, overseas companies looking at England as a safe place to leave large sums of money.
Yes, that's certainly true. I mean, I used to live in Mayfair, which always seemed to be a very empty place. That
Right.
I was there week in, week out, and never seemed to see much of my neighbours. But that's very much the exception, isn't it? You don't see that when you get out into the country at large. You see that properties are used to provide a return,
yes,
and that lots of landlords only have one or two properties, that there's this idea that they're all rackmen and they're all beastly landlords. But actually, most of them are delighted to have a good tenant who will stay for some years.
Absolutely, and who wouldn't? It's a partnership, really, between landlord and tenant. One really can't survive without the other. And I think that what we're seeing now with the amount of regulation, tax changes, regulation coming with EPC changes that fortunately have been delayed for a couple of years but are still going to be quite severe. We've seen really the exiting from the market of a lot of the sort of what we call the mum and dad type investors who have got one or two properties for their pension or for their children in inheritance. And that they often are the people who look after their tenants the best, I've found.
And that restricting the market will actually be worse for tenants because there will be fewer properties, and inevitably if there are fewer properties, prices will rise, that the return on a freehold property that you expect if you let it out will go up because it's harder to get your property back, harder to get tenants out, and supply is restricted.
Absolutely. We've seen it already for various reasons. 20% isn't uncommon in London and some of the major cities, 10% pretty much across the nation. And that's all got to be found by fairly hard-pressed tenants now who are struggling already with fuel bills, food increases and so on.
Well, we seem to be coming to a worrying degree of agreement, but it does seem the answer is to build more and don't pillory the landlord, who is a source of good rather than of evil.
I would completely agree.